Born in the arid outskirts of Chihuahua in the early 1800s, Guadalupe Bejarano was raised in an environment shaped by superstition, poverty, and the rigid expectations of colonial Catholicism. The world she entered was already stacked against women, yet it was also one that allowed cunning to survive, even thrive, beneath the mask of virtue. From an early age, Bejarano displayed qualities that made her a central figure in her community: charisma, maternal warmth, and an unwavering connection to the church. These attributes were not just respected, they were revered. In a small town where poverty shaped faith and trust was often born of shared struggle, she became something more than just a woman. She was a caretaker, a midwife, a godmother to the dying. And no one suspected the rot underneath. As a young woman, Guadalupe married into a modest family. Her husband was a quiet man, often ill, and their union seemed uneventful to outsiders. But his death, though tragic, marked the first in a string of eerie patterns. Neighbors whispered about how quickly she seemed to recover, how she didn't wear black as long as most widows did, how she had money to pay off debts and even buy land within weeks. Still, no one questioned her. They chalked it up to divine grace, the way God repays the faithful. Her grief, performed with tears at Sunday Mass and candlelit prayers, was enough to silence suspicion. But it would not be the last time she stood near a fresh grave with dry eyes. Over time, Bejarano gained a reputation for helping the sick and impoverished, offering her home as a place of refuge for the weak and dying. Many arrived hungry or homeless. Many never left. While the town believed she was a saint in a shawl, she was meticulously building a body count. Her victims were chosen carefully: lonely drifters, widows with no children, the elderly with no inheritance trail. In every case, she ensured there were no close family members to ask questions. She positioned herself as their caretaker, often signing herself on as witness or executor in whatever rudimentary documentation the town had. No one thought twice about it. In fact, they thanked her. Guadalupe's intelligence lay not just in her methods but in her manipulation of expectations. She knew what people wanted to see: a pious woman, soft-spoken and giving, serving the poor. That image gave her more cover than any bribe ever could. She wore humility like armor. Her home smelled of herbs and incense, her table always had warm food for guests. Yet behind her gentle demeanor lay a mind calculating each move. Whether it was through arsenic slipped into broth or a poultice laced with crushed oleander, her methods were simple, undetectable, and almost always attributed to natural causes. People who died in Bejarano's care were believed to have been taken by God, and in a world with few doctors and fewer autopsies, death was rarely questioned. Illness was everywhere, and she simply became its handmaiden. Guadalupe Bejarano was also astute in managing her relationships with the local clergy and town leaders. She attended Mass daily, donated to the church when she could, and even housed visiting missionaries. In doing so, she built a reputation that made her nearly untouchable. Priests described her as holy, while others called her blessed by suffering. Ironically, her ability to feign piety became her greatest weapon. If there were doubters, they kept quiet. No one wanted to accuse a woman so closely tied to the church. This was a time when women were often assumed to be morally superior to men, inherently nurturing, incapable of the kind of darkness Bejarano harbored. She turned that stereotype into a smokescreen. Her neighbors grew used to the funerals. At first, they offered condolences. Later, they simply offered distance. The number of deaths surrounding her became almost mundane, part of her story, part of her myth. It became easier to accept than to investigate. She leveraged this social apathy with precision, choosing victims and timing their deaths during times of chaos, epidemics, or political unrest, moments when life was cheap and suspicion expensive. Even as whispers began to emerge, questions from travelers, distant relatives who never received letters, old friends who never returned, the town dismissed them. Bejarano, after all, was a woman of God. By the time the authorities began to seriously question her, the damage had long been done. Guadalupe Bejarano had embedded herself so deeply in the town's psyche that confronting her crimes meant confronting their complicity. Her life story, once believed to be a testament to sacrifice and selflessness, unraveled as something far more chilling. But even in the records that remain, fragments written by unsure hands and embellished by rumor, what emerges is a woman who carefully constructed her persona not only to shield herself but to sanctify her killings. Her transformation from devout matron to methodical killer was not sudden. It was a slow, deliberate descent hidden beneath layers of trust, religion, and social blindness. Guadalupe Bejarano's mastery was not in violence or brute force but in subtlety, persuasion, and performance. She did not need knives or pistols to kill. Her most potent weapon was belief, people's belief in her goodness, their belief in the healing power of her faith, and her own twisted belief that what she did served a higher purpose. While she cloaked herself in the language of the church and carried rosary beads like a badge of sanctity, her real tools were far more insidious. The arsenic in her tea, the laudanum in her tonics, the foxglove in her stew, all were carefully measured, tested, and delivered with a steady hand. She wore her victims down not through rage but through routine, offering kindness laced with poison, generosity paired with death. In a time when women were expected to be caretakers, Guadalupe leaned into that role so convincingly that no one dared question her motives. She styled herself as a healer, a curandera, a folk medicine woman who used herbs and spiritual remedies to tend to the sick. This alone gave her near-mythic status in her village. People traveled miles to visit her, believing that her prayers and potions were more effective than the sparse, often unreliable doctors available. In truth, this gave her ample opportunity to experiment, to test combinations, to understand how much a body could endure before it failed. Her patients trusted her completely, often surrendering their will, their pain, and their possessions to her care. Religion was her shield, but it was also her scalpel. Guadalupe quoted scripture, led small prayer circles, and spoke often about death not as an end but as a holy transition. She wove suffering into sainthood, encouraging her patients to embrace their decline as a spiritual path. She would often recite verses at the bedside of those she was slowly killing, creating a surreal, almost sacred atmosphere around the process. Her poison didn't just affect the body, it clouded the senses, blurred the lines between pain and peace, and made victims complicit in their own undoing. She made death feel like an anointing, not an attack. What made her method so terrifying was its intimacy. Bejarano did not kill from a distance. She watched as the color left her victims' faces, held their hands as they coughed blood, whispered prayers as their pulses slowed. Each death was a performance she directed, quiet, clean, and deliberate. She manipulated the symptoms of illness so convincingly that when someone finally succumbed, it looked like the natural course of an already deteriorating condition. Even when family members became suspicious, they lacked proof. And by then, Bejarano had often gained power of attorney, secured access to money or land, or ensured that records were vague or non-existent. She maintained detailed knowledge of her herbs and substances, passed down through generations and augmented by her own observations. Plants like oleander, nightshade, jimsonweed, and belladonna grew abundantly in the region, and she knew just how to prepare them in non-lethal doses that mimicked healing before they became fatal. She also knew how to delay the effects, allowing victims to appear to improve before suddenly collapsing. This bought her time and credibility. If someone died too quickly, it raised questions. But if they suffered slowly, it was seen as fate. In some cases, she killed over weeks, extending the poisoning in such small increments that the deaths were labeled as tuberculosis, typhoid, or exhaustion. Bejarano also understood the value of plausible deniability. She rarely administered poison in the presence of others and was careful to share responsibility when possible. She would involve young girls in her household to bring water or deliver meals, telling them what to add without revealing why. In doing so, she diffused blame and kept herself insulated. She always appeared to be helping, staying up through the night, weeping softly in corners, kissing the foreheads of the doomed. Her demeanor was so convincing that even doctors, when called, praised her efforts and left feeling reassured. By the time a body was in the ground, so was any chance of uncovering the truth. Even her language became a weapon. She used soft tones, spiritual metaphors, and stories of martyrs to normalize what she was doing. To a dying mother, she would say that heaven was calling. To a destitute worker, she promised peace beyond the suffering. She framed her poison as a passage, her role as a guide rather than an executioner. And it worked. Her reputation only grew as more people died in her care. She was not feared, she was revered. Her evil, wrapped in empathy and devotion, became nearly invisible. The poison she used wasn't just physical, it was psychological, social, and spiritual. And that's what made her unstoppable for so long. Guadalupe Bejarano operated in a world where women were idealized as moral guardians but rarely seen as capable of true danger. This paradox became her cloak. In 19th-century Mexican society, particularly in smaller towns and rural areas, a devout, motherly woman was above suspicion. Her actions were interpreted through the lens of piety and caretaking, rather than through the lens of ambition or malevolence. This cultural framing of womanhood offered her a level of immunity that a man in her position could never have dreamed of. She didn't need to hide her victims, she simply buried them with blessings, and the community responded with condolences instead of questions. The idea that a woman of God, a caregiver, could also be a killer was too uncomfortable, too inconceivable for most to entertain. The church, too, played a role, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not. Bejarano's deep involvement in religious activities made her a visible and familiar face to the clergy. She contributed to church fundraisers, helped clean the chapel, and frequently hosted Bible studies in her home. These acts were not mere displays of devotion, they were tactical. Each gesture bought her goodwill. Priests praised her in their sermons, calling her a living example of Christian charity. They often directed the sick and poor to her doorstep, believing she offered divine comfort and healing. When these same people died, their deaths were attributed to God's will rather than human intervention. The church, while not complicit in her crimes, certainly reinforced the illusion that she was incapable of them. Local law enforcement, limited in both manpower and training, also failed to recognize the signs. Deaths among the poor or elderly were common, especially in areas plagued by disease, malnutrition, and political unrest. In such a chaotic environment, the quiet disappearance of a drifter or the slow demise of an elderly widow drew little attention. Bejarano understood this well. She chose her victims not only for their vulnerability but for the likelihood that no one would advocate for them. She deliberately avoided targeting people with strong family ties or social standing. Her kills were strategic, often timed during festivals, harvests, or times of regional conflict when the town's attention was elsewhere. The broader culture of silence and respect for religious women added another layer of protection. People spoke of her in hushed tones, using words like holy, blessed, or touched by the hand of God. To criticize her, even to question her, felt like blasphemy to many. There were whispers, certainly, stories of people who died too suddenly, of families who never received letters again, of land deeds quietly changing hands, but no one was willing to risk community exile by voicing them loudly. In a small town, reputation was everything, and Bejarano's was nearly bulletproof. Her status as a spiritual caregiver made her untouchable, especially to the women who saw her as a role model and the men who saw her as harmless. Guadalupe also took advantage of the lack of investigative infrastructure. Autopsies were rare, and when performed, they were rudimentary at best. There was no central record-keeping, no consistent coroner, no system for identifying patterns. Each death was logged separately, treated as an isolated incident. Even when a pattern began to emerge, multiple deaths in a short span, similar symptoms, the same beneficiary, no one had the resources or authority to connect the dots. Bejarano was acutely aware of this gap. She exploited it with precision, maintaining a slow pace of killings that never aroused enough suspicion to spur a full investigation. She also benefited from how her victims were perceived. Most were marginalized individuals, the impoverished, the sick, the elderly, the mentally ill. Their lives were already considered fragile, their deaths inevitable. Society did not value them enough to protect them. Their absence created barely a ripple. Bejarano's crimes were, in many ways, facilitated by the very structure of the society she lived in, a structure that devalued certain lives, glorified religious obedience, and refused to see women as agents of harm. Even when initial suspicions finally reached local officials, the reaction was tepid. Authorities were hesitant to act, not only because of her gender but because an investigation into Bejarano meant an investigation into the system itself. It meant questioning the role of the church, the negligence of the law, the failures of medicine. It meant confronting how many people had enabled her by looking the other way. Many preferred to preserve the illusion than confront the truth. In this way, Bejarano's crimes became less about what she did alone and more about what an entire society allowed to happen under the guise of faith, tradition, and trust. The people Guadalupe Bejarano chose to kill were not just vulnerable, they were invisible in the eyes of society. Each victim, carefully selected and quietly erased, was someone who lived on the margins of 19th-century Mexican life, the elderly without children, the chronically ill, the poor, the unwanted, the forgotten. They were men and women who had slipped through the cracks of a society too overwhelmed to care and too rooted in religious and social hierarchy to notice when another voiceless soul disappeared. Bejarano didn't just kill them, she ensured that their stories died with them. There were no public outcries, no portraits hanging on walls, no weeping family members demanding justice. In many cases, there wasn't even a name recorded after their burial. In a community structured by strong class divisions and religious piety, the lives of the poor were often measured only by how much they suffered. The sick who could not work were seen as burdens. The homeless were viewed as wanderers without purpose or protection. Bejarano understood this perception deeply. She knew that by targeting people whom society had already given up on, her actions would blend into the background noise of everyday hardship. Deaths among the destitute were common and largely accepted as part of life's cruel order. So when an old woman, without family, wasting away from fever, finally passed under Guadalupe's care, there was no one to demand an explanation. No questions were asked. No suspicions were raised. The pattern became especially grim when considering how Guadalupe framed her assistance. She offered food, shelter, and healing at no cost, acts that appeared saintly on the surface but were calculated for maximum control. The victims, desperate and alone, viewed her home as sanctuary. In truth, it was a carefully crafted cage. Once inside, their fates were sealed. Most were too weak or too indebted to leave. Bejarano positioned herself as their final hope, but instead of salvation, she delivered slow, calculated death. It was a cruelty that wore the mask of care, and her victims, too frail or too grateful to see through it, died believing she had tried to save them. Some of the people who passed through her home might have sensed something was wrong, a bitterness in the tea, a sudden dizziness after eating, strange dreams or hallucinations that didn't match their illnesses. But those small moments of doubt were usually swallowed by their desperation. Even if they had tried to speak out, their words would likely have been dismissed as the delirium of sickness. Bejarano's reputation, so deeply rooted in spiritual trust and communal goodwill, always outweighed the whispers of the dying. Her victims were not only physically weak but socially powerless. They had no one to speak for them, no one who knew their stories well enough to recognize the unnatural silence that followed their deaths. The tragedy deepened when victims did have someone, a distant cousin, a traveling friend, a former employer, who came searching for them. These people were often met with vague explanations. Bejarano might say the person left suddenly, caught a train, moved south for work, or passed quietly during an epidemic. She knew how to shape the narrative to avoid attention. The lack of written records and the slow communication of the time meant that her lies rarely met resistance. Even when someone returned to the town to investigate further, they were often met with the same wall of reverence that had shielded her for years. Locals would defend her, citing her acts of charity and kindness. Rumors were quashed before they grew into anything threatening. Each victim's story, if pieced together, might have formed a map of Guadalupe's intent. An orphan boy who never made it to the city. A sick miner whose wages disappeared along with his body. A woman who had no dowry, no kin, and no name on paper. These were not random killings. They were deliberate eliminations of people whose absences would not be questioned. Bejarano exploited a social blindness that saw the poor as expendable. She understood that if you removed someone who had already been erased by society, no one would notice they were gone. The funerals she arranged were modest, if they happened at all. Sometimes there were prayers, sometimes just a quick burial in the local cemetery with no stone, no cross, no mention of who lay beneath the soil. The church cooperated, more out of routine than interest, offering last rites and murmured blessings without once realizing they were enabling a serial killer. The lives Bejarano ended were treated with the same indifference in death that they had been given in life. No obituaries, no parish records marked with urgency, no mass held in their honor. These victims vanished quietly, not because they wanted to, but because no one gave them space to exist in the first place. The investigation into Guadalupe Bejarano's crimes was neither swift nor thorough. It was hesitant, delayed, and mired in the very same reverence and disbelief that had shielded her for so long. When whispers of irregular deaths and curious coincidences finally began to surface with enough frequency to demand attention, the local authorities faced a dilemma they were unprepared to address. The idea that a respected woman, known throughout the town for her piety and healing, could be the center of such darkness seemed implausible. Even the first murmurs of inquiry were couched in caution, not accusation. The officials didn't want to offend her or the church or their own community's perception of what a holy woman could or could not be. The first signs of trouble were small. A family member of a deceased man, who had passed under Bejarano's care, questioned why all of the man's belongings had ended up in her possession. A neighbor noted the quick succession of deaths occurring in her home, all with similar symptoms: fever, vomiting, confusion, a slow decline that always ended with Bejarano praying at the bedside. A traveling priest passing through the area made note of the unmarked graves, the quiet funerals, the absence of mourning relatives. But these suspicions were fragile things, easily broken by a kind word from Guadalupe, a shared scripture, a teary recollection of trying so hard to help. Pressure finally began to mount when a young constable, newly assigned to the district, decided to cross-check names of the deceased with land transfers and small estate documents. What he found was disturbing. In more than a dozen cases, Bejarano had ended up with either full control or partial ownership of the dead person's possessions, no matter how minor. Though each case appeared, on the surface, to be justified, signed notes, verbal witnesses, priestly endorsements, the pattern was too consistent to ignore. She wasn't just helping the dying, she was profiting from them. As word of this investigation quietly spread, resistance followed. Some townspeople defended her vehemently, accusing the constable of targeting a woman because of her gender or her devotion. Others, while suspicious, were afraid to speak openly. In a place where religious status held as much weight as legal authority, casting doubt on someone like Bejarano was seen as dangerous. Even within the local church, priests were divided. Some were horrified by the idea that they had stood beside a killer, administering blessings while she administered poison. Others refused to believe it, arguing that the deaths were coincidental, and that Bejarano's religious service was being weaponized against her unfairly. This division slowed the investigation further. Files were misplaced or ignored. Requests for autopsies were delayed, then denied. Crucial testimonies were never recorded. Some who might have testified were already dead, others had moved far away, and some simply refused to relive the fear or guilt they associated with their suspicions. the burden of evidence remained frustratingly elusive. Most of the deaths had occurred years prior, with no physical remains to examine, and no witnesses willing to contradict what the church and the town had already accepted as truth. Despite these setbacks, the constable persisted. He began collecting witness statements in secret, speaking to drifters who had passed through, to women who once worked in Bejarano's kitchen, to a young girl who claimed she had seen Guadalupe grinding herbs she was forbidden to touch. The girl spoke of strange smells, of animals that refused to eat certain foods from the kitchen, of patients who seemed to get worse after receiving Bejarano's special teas. Though dismissed as childish imagination by some, these fragments of testimony began to form a mosaic that pointed to something more sinister than coincidence. Finally, with pressure mounting and the support of a few outspoken townspeople, a formal inquiry was launched. Bejarano was summoned for questioning, not arrested, but invited, a reflection of the community's lingering deference to her stature. She arrived calmly, dressed in her usual modest shawl, with a Bible in hand. Her answers were deliberate, her tone composed, her demeanor unshaken. She claimed that any wealth she acquired came from grateful patients or abandoned property. She denied knowing how anyone had died, asserting she only offered comfort and prayer in their final moments. Her performance was convincing enough that some officials left the hearing believing she was a victim of rumor, a holy woman persecuted by envy and misunderstanding. But the evidence, while largely circumstantial, continued to grow. One physician, an outsider with no ties to the town, reviewed notes and testimonies and suggested that several of the deaths bore the marks of poisoning. Without preserved bodies, there could be no definitive conclusion, but the consistency of symptoms across multiple cases, sudden seizures, erratic heart rates, violent vomiting, matched known poisons used in folk medicine when administered improperly or with malicious intent. Still, without a confession or a direct witness to the act of poisoning, the investigation reached a standstill. What emerged from the process was not a conviction, but a reckoning, a realization that the town had placed its faith in an illusion, and that the system they trusted had almost allowed a monster to disappear completely without ever being questioned. The story of Guadalupe Bejarano lingers not only because of the horror she inflicted but because of what it revealed about the society that let her flourish. Her legacy is not a tale of a singularly evil woman hiding in the shadows, it is a mirror held up to a culture that failed to see her for what she truly was. The quiet reverence that surrounded her, the blind faith extended to her words and deeds, the institutional reluctance to question her actions, all combined to create a vacuum in which evil could thrive without resistance. Her crimes were horrifying, but the silence that followed them was perhaps more unsettling. It was the kind of silence that grows from fear, from shame, and from the realization that the systems built to protect the innocent often fail the moment comfort is threatened. Bejarano became something more than a murderer, she became folklore, a name spoken with nervous laughter and half-believed caution in later generations. Stories of her circulated like warnings wrapped in riddles. Some said she had made a pact with the devil, others insisted she was misunderstood, a healer whose remedies had gone wrong. Over time, her image was twisted, softened, even romanticized in certain retellings. The truth, documented only in fractured court records, faded testimonies, and buried memories, was far less ambiguous. She had manipulated her way into the hearts of a community, then used that trust to feed a darkness she never had to explain. Her ability to elude justice for so long was a product of the very ideals her town prized most: piety, obedience, and a belief that true evil could never wear a rosary. There is little in the historical record to suggest that Bejarano ever expressed remorse or offered an explanation. Her life after the investigation remains murky, full of contradictions. Some reports suggest she moved away quietly, slipping into another town under a different name. Others claim she died in her sleep, never held accountable, her secrets buried with her. What is clear is that no formal charges ever led to a conviction. Whether out of fear, incompetence, or deliberate avoidance, the final judgment never came in a courtroom. Instead, it came in fragments, passed down by word of mouth, etched into whispered warnings, remembered in the cautious eyes of those who had once called her a saint. Today, Guadalupe Bejarano's name barely exists in the official narrative of Mexican criminal history. She is not listed among the infamous figures of national infamy. There are no museums, no plaques, no widely taught lessons about her case. Her story exists in the margins, in local folklore, in dusty archives rarely accessed. But those who study her case see more than just the actions of a single person. They see a portrait of systemic failure, a case study in how charisma and religious performance can override accountability, how gendered assumptions can distort justice, and how the poor and forgotten remain the easiest targets in any society. Bejarano's legacy also challenges modern understandings of serial crime, particularly in contexts where formal investigative practices were minimal or non-existent. Long before criminal profiling, forensic science, or psychological diagnoses were tools in the justice system, individuals like Bejarano were operating in shadows the system didn't even know to illuminate. Her killings predate the language and framework we now use to categorize serial offenders, and yet they fit the pattern with chilling precision. Motive, method, and manipulation, all present. Yet because she was a woman, and because she cloaked herself in religious virtue, she avoided the labels that might have pursued a man under similar suspicion. Her story continues to matter because it asks uncomfortable questions. How many others like her have existed, operating quietly under the mask of social trust? How many were protected by the very myths communities cling to, about who can be evil, who can be dangerous, and who must be innocent simply because they appear righteous? Bejarano's life is not just a historical anomaly but a warning embedded in time. She was able to thrive because no one wanted to believe she could exist. Even today, that reluctance lingers. People still hesitate to question those entrusted roles, still ignore patterns that don't fit their expectations, still hold on to comforting archetypes about goodness and morality. The story of Guadalupe Bejarano is less about closure and more about confrontation. It confronts the idea that killers must look or act a certain way. It confronts the failure of institutions to protect the vulnerable. It confronts the consequences of unchecked trust, especially when placed in individuals who use religion or social standing as armor. Her legacy forces a reckoning not only with what she did, but with what was allowed to happen because of who she appeared to be.